May I have your attention, please?
Welcome to Real Gaijin, unveiling the real Japan, an American expat's inside look. Now it's time for another story from the Read My Lips series of podcasts. Summarized podcast.
Okay, we're live. Hey, it's Mark Kennedy. I'm the host of the Real Gaijin Substack and podcast. Today we have a very special guest, a very accomplished scholar and also professional broadcaster who even works for the BBC. This is Chris Harding. Chris, you want to say hello?
Hello. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And we have many people that are planning to tune in today, so we're looking forward to it. Chris and I have a rather ambitious agenda. Now, Real Gaijin is all about how foreigners living and working in Japan and interacting with Japan are impacting the country. But we're almost always focused on people that are here right now. It's important, though, to take a look at other foreigners, other real Gaijin who have played a major role in the development of Japan's interaction with the West for literally centuries. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. Now, Chris Harding is a cultural historian, and we'll let him explain what that is in just a second. But what he is going to do is showcase four people that through the centuries have had a real big impact on relations between Japan and the West that has had a profound impact to change the country. So we'll get into that in just a second. I want to do some housekeeping first. Number one, we will be recording this session, and that'll come out in maybe give me 24 hours or so, if possible. Also, questions. Even though we have a full agenda, we are wide open for questions, encouraging that. Try it at any point. Now, the two of us can only access this live functionality via our mobile phones, so we're going to have to do everything while looking at the chat. So cut us some slack, okay? But we'll both be checking for questions. Okay, so today what we're going to do is Chris is going to do 3 deep dives into 3 historical episodes and give you some background about each one. The first one, we're going way back. We're going back into the middle of the 16th century, as a matter of fact, to talk about Francis Xavier. But before we do that, first we want to hear about Chris. What's your background, Chris? Please introduce yourself.
Hello. Yes, I am historian of Japan, modern Japan mainly, as you've said. I had my first chance to go to Japan thanks to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, scarily 21 years ago. Makes me feel makes me feel really old. One of the things about working in a university is you feel older every year because the students are always 18 or 19 coming in. So yeah, 20 years ago, I was out in Japan for a couple of years, thanks to Daiwa, studying at Keio. We're going to talk about its founder, Fukuzawa Yukichi, later. Working on the Asahi Shimbun newspaper, their English language edition. My Japanese wasn't good enough to be a journalist in Japan. It probably isn't good enough now to do that. But a wonderful time doing all that. And then moved back to the UK. I was a musician for a little while, and then I got myself a job at Edinburgh University in Scotland, and that's where I still am now.
Well, yes, a few of us have heard of that university. Very famous. Wonderful.
That's a relief.
Also, so you've also been a professional broadcaster, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. The BBC, again, many years ago, 10, 12 years ago, they run an annual competition in the UK where they pick, it's kind of like it used to be called, embarrassingly, like an X Factor for academics, where you pitch them their ideas and you sort of battle with each other. And the 10 people each year who they choose, you get to make your own programs, and they kind of train you up actually as a broadcast journalist. So I've done a few documentaries.
Wow.
There's one actually which might interest some of your viewers. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. I think it's available because it's radio. I think it's available in Japan. I hope so. It's called Misunderstanding Japan, a kind of light-hearted look at archive footage for Westerners who have struggled to get their heads around Japan. So that was fun. And with luck, in I think 2 or 3 weeks' time, people may have heard of the BBC Proms series of concerts that get held in London at the Royal Albert Hall. Joe Hisaishi of Studio Ghibli fame is going to be there and conducting one of his own pieces. So I'm hoping to interview him while he's in the UK. So that'll be a good moment, a kind of fanboy moment. I have to try and keep myself under control meeting him, but that should be fun.
That is terrific. Well, I definitely want to tune in for that. Great. So, without further ado, let us go back in time, literally, what, 4 or 5 centuries here, almost, to the time of Francis Xavier. Who was he? Why is he important to Japan?
He's a fascinating figure, and it's a really interesting moment. So what you'll have to do, Mark, is you'll have to sort of cut me off if I'm going over and we need to move on to our next person. But I, yeah, um, but I love this period in Japan's history. It's the middle of the 16th century. You've got the Portuguese and the Spanish empires are just starting to expand. So these ships going out all over the world, and the Portuguese get to Japan in the 1540s. And Francis Xavier comes out just a few years later, I think 1549, he lands in Japan. He was a missionary with the Jesuits, this Catholic religious order. They sort of used the Portuguese trading ships as a global taxi service, to get them out to all these destinations and preach the gospel. Um, and the reason I think the Jesuits are so interesting is they were mostly quite intellectual young men. And they thought if you go to a place like Japan, what you ideally want to do is convert the people who are at the top, socially at the top of society. And then there'll be a kind of trickle down. If the elites convert, then there's a kind of, an escalator effect or a trickle down effect where ordinary people might think, I might have a crack at that. So their aim was to ideally meet the emperor, meet the shogun. They weren't really sure kind of who was in charge in Japan at this point, but they wanted to meet the top people. And what they also wanted to do was try to understand Japanese culture. They were, I think, quite right in saying places like Japan, China, and India, if you barge in ignoring the civilized cultures that are already there and just preach the gospel, no one's going to take you seriously. So someone like Francis Xavier, he was trying to learn Japanese while he was there, just for a very short time. And so were the rest of the Jesuits. And it's one of these moments. What really interests me about it, I think, is not just cultural communication, right, but cultural miscommunication. And maybe that's a theme for the real Gaijin as well. We've all had it in Japan where things don't go quite as expected.
Daily.
Yeah, right, daily, yeah. And this was very much the case with the Jesuits. Just to give you one example that always stays with me, um, the Francis Xavier and his men, when they landed in Japan, they landed in Kagoshima, so they were really focused on Kyushu, really, in their mission. Um, they said to the local Japanese people when they arrived that they had come from India because the Portuguese had a base in Goa in southern India. So to that extent, that was true. But when they met some of Japan's Buddhists, the Buddhists got really excited because they thought, well, maybe these people are bringing a new version of the Buddhist teachings direct from India, because the Jesuits had claimed to be from India. So they were really excited to meet the Jesuits under false pretenses. The Jesuits, meanwhile, had been informed all about Japan by a sort of slightly unreliable individual called Yajiro, or Anjiro, some people call him, who had told them that there is this religion in Japan where it was founded by a wise man from the West. He gave loads of commandments. People now worship and remember him by means of rosaries, statues, paintings, chanting, incense, prayer, monasteries. For the Jesuits, they thought this must be Christianity. But Christianity must have made it to Japan at some point, and there was this kind of residual memory, right, that they could work with and convert people. But of course, this guy, Anjiro, was describing Buddhism, because from the Japanese point of view, of
Mine is
course, yeah, Siddhartha Gautama, founder of Buddhism, is of course the wise man from the West. And all those things were true that I've just listed, about Japanese Buddhism. Um, and so there was at first enormous high hopes on both sides. And then they come crashing down. The Jesuits start preaching against Buddhism. You can see them writing letters back to Goa saying, send us some more great vestments and candles, because these Buddhists, they really know how to do a good ritual. And if we want to compete with them, we need to look good, and we need choirs and all sorts of cool things like that. The Buddhists yeah, everything that could try to compete with the sheer spectacle of a wonderful, rich, sonorous Buddhist ritual. The Jesuits thought for ordinary people who might not be very philosophically sophisticated, you could just got to put on a good show, right? So that's what they were hoping to do. Buddhists, meanwhile, were so upset that they took the Latin word for God, Deus, and they twisted it to Dai Uso. It's a big lie, right? In Japanese. And they started preaching against the Christians, which is actually quite a good play on the word Deus, right? I think you've got to allow them that. Um,
Dave.
so,
So yeah, but maybe I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
go ahead.
fascinating. Okay, Diane, so I'm never gonna forget that. Um, Kagoshima, kind of an interesting spot. I would have. I mean, I know this is before Dejima in Nagasaki, but they must have come across the Shimazu clan who were in charge, right? How did they manage not to be killed on sight?
Ah, that's a great point. So what they did was the Jesuits, I think they played their hand quite carefully. So they had used these Portuguese trading vessels as, like I say, a kind of taxi service to get there. And these Portuguese traders were trading between Japan, China, India, and Europe. And in particular, between China and Japan, at this point, in the mid 1500s, there had been arguments between the Japanese and the Chinese about piracy. The Chinese
Mm.
were accusing the Japanese of not cracking down on seaborne piracy and endangering these Chinese communities as a result. So trade had been kind of cut off. So the Portuguese instead got involved in this trade, and it was hugely profitable. You know, you could buy silk for a certain amount in China and then sell it in Japan for a huge markup. So really, really lucrative trade. And what the missionaries said was, well, if you're prepared to listen to us, listen to the gospel, perhaps give us somewhere to preach, somewhere to stay, then we will persuade our Portuguese compatriots to choose your port, somewhere, you know, along the coast of Kyushu, perhaps, as the place where they'll land their ships. And you can then tap that trade, and you can do rather well financially out of them. So they played that hand quite carefully. And what's interesting is you get a series of daimyo, these great feudal lords in Kyushu, who convert to Christianity. So you have this phenomenon of Christian daimyo, right, in the second half of the 16th century. Some taken by the gospel, others maybe being a bit more practical in terms of doing business, you know, with these foreigners. So I think by doing that, the Jesuits managed to get, you know, get themselves in the good books to some extent, although they weren't always taken very seriously. And this really bothered Francis Xavier, this key figure we've been talking about. Because the Japanese, it's funny actually, through the eyes of the missionaries, we get our first Western impressions of Japan. And it always strikes me that what they noticed is often what first time Westerners going to Japan will notice and write about. So things like, for example, cleanliness, the importance of cleanliness, of regular bathing, of good manners, of using chopsticks well. So all these things, after a while, the Jesuits realized that they were in Japan preaching the gospel, this elevated philosophical ideal. But ordinary Japanese thought that they stank, they spoke bad Japanese, couldn't use chopsticks. They lived, they had livestock in their houses, which they would then, you know, kill and eat. That was also disgusting, you know, and unhygienic. So they weren't being taken seriously because of their lifestyles. And so they had to clean themselves up. They had to learn to use chopsticks. They had to learn how to do the tea ceremony. So they really had to pull their socks up and behave well.
This figure, Anjiro, this was a counselor ongoing for Francis, or he stopped at one point?
So Angelo, we think he escaped Japan aboard a Portuguese ship sometime before the Jesuits came. He had been
Oh,
accused, I think, of a murder, and so he was running away. And then he ended up in Goa, that big hub for the Jesuits, and that was where they apparently taught him their language. From him, got some idea of Japanese, and tried to get a sense from him of how Japanese culture and Buddhism worked. And although I think he was quite well, he ended up giving a misleading impression about Buddhism, but I think that was mainly the fault of the Jesuits. But he was quite accurate, I think, anyway, on one point about Japanese culture. I don't know if some of your listeners may have heard the phrase "kuchi bakari." My wife is from Okayama and she uses this all the time. You're all mouth, basically. I hear that constantly. Um, and this is what Angelo taught the Jesuits. He said, whatever you preach to them, what they're really going to look at is how you live and who you are. And only when they've seen what kind of human beings you are and what kind of people your philosophy creates will they think about converting. They're not going to be swung by a clever argument. They want to see who you really are. And I think that's a lovely little insight, actually. And I think it rings true, certainly to my experience of Japan when I've been there.
Now, I know Francis Xavier, you're going to tell us in just a minute, I imagine, about his travels across the country, at least not all the way to the emperor, but toward the emperor. But
Mm.
before we get to that, I'm curious. I was literally just visiting Kagoshima last week. I like Nagasaki. Are there any remnants of Christianity or any anything left behind by Francis Xavier and the Jesuits from that period in Kagoshima today?
So not terribly much in terms of material culture that's still around because the Japanese Christians were persecuted so heavily under the Tokugawa shogunate from the mid 1600s for a couple of hundred years. There is a rather lovely church in Nagasaki, the Ora Cathedral, which was
Mhm.
built in the 1860s. So it's still a relatively old sort of monument to Japanese Christianity. There's also, I've never been there, so I can't vouch for it, but there is a St. Francis Xavier Park in
Mm,
Kagoshima, which has a monument
good.
to him, and also I think Anjiro, this famously unreliable in unreliable is maybe unfair, but this pivotal figure, this informant for
Right.
Francis Xavier and his people. So that'd be one place to perhaps visit.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so once Francis Xavier arrived in Kagoshima, how did he go about trying to learn Japanese?
So he had some short scripts made for him by Anjiro. So with a
Mm,
mixture of this kind of scripting by Anjiro and then Francis Xavier trying to put together a really basic catechism in Japanese and preach on the basis of that. That's how he did it. And there are stories about him preaching on the just outside Zen monasteries, for example, on the steppes, um, because the Buddhists by this point had been pegged as the people you need to try and compete with, basically. And on at least one occasion, one of the sources says that they were met by laughter by the Japanese. So didn't necessarily go,
like that.
terribly well. No, I think also one of Xavier's compatriots, another one of the Jesuits. Forget his name, but he was preaching at the court of one of the daimyo, and the Jesuits had picked up this idea. There was a real clash between Christian attitudes towards homosexuality, which were very negative and very strict, and in Japan, in certain corners of Japanese society, just completely normal, those kinds of relationships, especially between a slightly older man and a younger man in the context of Buddhism, in the context of samurai culture.
Mm,
And one of these missionaries preached, I suppose in quite bad Japanese, but at length about the evils of relationships between men or between men and boys. And I think that kind of thing, being lectured on morals by foreigners who were already considered to be quite dirty, quite strange, spoke bad Japanese. Those sorts of moments, I think, for the Jesuits went rather badly. And by the time by the time Francis Xavier left, he had
mm,
made, some people say that all sorts of numbers are given for the numbers of converts, but he'd got a kind of foothold
mm,
in Kyushu. He, as you say, he'd never got to the emperor, and people were never quite clear. The Jesuits were never quite clear about who you really needed to speak to in Japan in this period. And to be fair, a lot of Japanese people probably didn't know either. This is a period of
yeah,
warring
right.
states, right?
Mm,
Sengoku Jidai.
mm,
Um, so it was a difficult period to try and find out who to speak to. But interestingly, and maybe just to finish up, because I know we want to get time on our other three, but in
mm,
terms of briefly where it went afterwards, which always really interests me, the Jesuits did manage to clean up their operation. And so by the 1580s, you have a generation of Jesuits. So this is sort of 30, 40 years after Xavier
mm,
arrived. You've got a generation of Jesuits who actually are quite clued up about Japanese culture. And one person in particular, Louis Froich, Portuguese Jesuit, writes a book which basically takes the form. And it's funny because a lot of travel writers will still do this about Japan, or at least they did probably up until the 1990s. I think it's more sophisticated now. But back in the day, they would say Japanese people do X, Western people do Y.
mm.
And they would have a whole series of couplets like that to
Ah,
try and explain Japan, to a
mm,
Western audience.
mm,
So he did that, and he also, a lot of your listeners will have heard of Oda Nobunaga, the great
yeah.
warlord, the first unifier of Japan. He actually got on quite well with the Jesuits on the basis that my f- the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I think that's the right phrase.
Mhm.
Basically, Oda Nobunaga was fed up with the Buddhists because of the power they wielded, and he thought he could do business with the Jesuits and sort of join forces against Buddhists. And he questioned Louis Freud at length. He wanted to know about India. He wanted to know about China. Wanted to know about the West. So you have this theme of Westerners starting to, or small groups of Westerners starting to become conduits of information about the broader West into Japan for important Japanese elites like Oda Nobunaga.
Very interesting. So then, just to finish off on Francis Xavier's time in Japan, so he tried to make his way, I guess, north up to Hirado and then across to Kyoto. I understand.
Mm.
What happened when he didn't meet the emperor? Did he go home, or what? I didn't follow up on that.
Yeah, he had a miserable winter trudge there and back again, and getting
Cool.
nowhere at all. Um, yeah, I don't think they had a clue about how to approach this diplomatically. And the idea that the emperor would see some random southern barbarian, as they were called at the time, the West being obviously the West, but southern barbarians, Francis and that lot were called southern barbarians because they were arriving into Kyushu from the trade route from India via the coast of China. So yeah,
Since
the
I
idea
live
that
in
the
Kyushu,
emperor.
maybe that's my new nickname.
Oh, well, there you go. If you ever need a new Substack name, call yourself Southern Barbarian. That'd be great. Why not?
But so, did Francis end up finally getting back to Spain, or what happened after that?
So he wanted to get to China. That was his big aim. But he passed away in Asia just before he got a chance to get into
Oh,
China. The Chinese were a harder nut to crack earlier on than the Japanese. The Jesuits started to do okay there towards the end of the 1500s, but Francis Xavier sadly never had a chance to do that.
okay. Well, I guess that's a fitting segue to the end of the story on
Mm,
Francis Xavier, and we'll skip forward a couple of hundred years, I guess, at this point, right?
mm.
So the
Yeah.
next one that we're going to talk about is another intriguing Japanese person, Yoshida Shoin, who then meets um, Commodore Perry from the United States. Tell us about that. And well, first of all, who were these people?
Yeah, so this is, as you say, we're fast forwarding. So in terms of a 60-second bit of context, the Jesuits ended up making, and the Franciscans, when they came out, these other missionaries, made such a nuisance of themselves that in the early 1600s, as I'm sure many of your viewers will know, um, once the Civil War era was over and the Tokugawa shogunate was established in Edo, the decision was made to basically shut out Europeans because of all this trouble. They were doing politics and they were spreading rumors that perhaps Spain or Portugal might be setting up Japan for colonization, and the missionaries would be their sort of their advance guard. There's this phrase, first comes the Bible, then comes the sword. And so the Japanese were worried about that. Hideyoshi in particular, this famous warlord, was absolutely furious, and he became infamous in Europe for crucifying a number of European and Japanese Christians at Nagasaki. um, so having kind of closed their borders, um, anyone who's in Kyushu will surely know that the Dutch at Nagasaki were the kind of big conduit for information about the West coming in. The Dutch being Protestants, promising not to get involved in preaching Christianity, even to the point, I think, where when their ships used to arrive from Europe into Dejima, this artificial island in Nagasaki Bay, which is a wonderful place to visit. Have you been to
It's,
Dejima?
it's
Fantastic
tiny.
history creation. Yeah, you imagine spending, months and months there,
No,
literally with nothing much to
no.
do, and not being able to cross over into Japan
Yeah.
proper, right? So they were there, and when their ships would arrive, the Japanese authorities would go on board. They had to any Bibles they had on board, they had to stick them in barrels and nail the barrels shut. And if they were discovered trying to bring any of this kind of, philosophical contraband into Japan, they would be in serious trouble. So I think they were quite good about that. One thing that always strikes me about this interlude is, and it's possible to exaggerate it, so we've got to be a bit careful, but the relative incuriosity on both sides, right? One about the other. So the Dutch, for the most part, there are a few honorable exceptions, but if you see pictures of the Dutch in Nagasaki, they're playing badminton or they're playing billiards. They're not really interested, it doesn't seem, in Japanese culture particularly much, which seems like, a real shame. And then the other way around, historians a few years ago found some of the reports that the Dutch used to create for the shogunate, and they would take them to Edo with them when they went to sort of pay their respects every year, sometimes every couple of years. And these reports had been preserved in wonderfully pristine condition. And some historians thought, this is amazing. The shogunate must really have valued this knowledge, right? They kept them so carefully.
Mhm.
Turns out they were pristine because they hadn't bothered reading them because they weren't really
Oh,
interested. So, this chance to learn about what's going on in the outside world, there really wasn't terribly much interest, certainly not, in the shogunate itself. There were lots of Japanese people who did try to learn about the West via the Dutch so-called rangaku, which we'll get to when we
yeah.
talk about Fukuzawa Yukichi's Dutch
All right.
studies, basically. But I suppose that's the backdrop, right? That's the backdrop. And by the time that Yoshida Shoin is born, 1830, the shogunate, it's been pretty successful, right? People who love things like woodblock prints or tea culture, geisha culture, kabuki, all these things. The Edo period is beautiful in terms of culture. But by the early 19th century, things start to go wrong. So if you are a samurai in Japan, you're a very small proportion of the population. And officially, you're right at the top of this quite strict social hierarchy, swaggering around town with your two swords in your belt, and commoners have to shuffle out of your way and bow down to you. Um, in reality, for a lot of samurai, merchants who are almost at the bottom of the social system are wealthier, they've got nicer houses, they eat better, they have better lives. And it's very obvious that some of the big merchants in places like Osaka, Kyoto, and Edo are living the high life, while samurai are trying to put on a good show, basically. I love that there are these stories where you'll get a samurai house, which from the outside looks beautiful and well kept, and inside it's decrepit, and they're not eating well, and they haven't got much cash, but they're trying to make it look good for the sake of the family
Mhm.
name. So there's a sense that society is going really badly wrong because of this topsy-turvy situation with merchants and samurai. And Yoshida Shoin, I think, is fascinating because he's one of a number of young, rebellious samurai who are born into this world where things don't seem right. But he doesn't want to. So he really wants to do something about it. I keep thinking, if I was born in that time, I would make the best of it. I'd maybe keep my head down, as a middle-ranking samurai, and get on with it, and maybe complain now and again, over a coffee or a cup of tea to someone, but not really do anything. But Yoshida Shoin, not that kind of personality at all. He becomes one of these radical young men who takes a long, hard look at Japan, and also is very interested in anything he can get his hands on that will tell him about the West. The combination of those two things marks out a generation. Or they call themselves later shishi, so men of high purpose. And they become this really interesting, and if you're the shogunate, a really worrying combination of interested in Japanese history, interested in world history, interested in weapons and gunnery and Western technology, interested in sword fighting, and interested in politics. So, if I was a particularly powerful shogun in Edo, anyone who fitted that description, I'd basically round them up and put them in prison, because it's a very worrying combination. Um, and Yoshida Shoin is one of those. So, born in Choshu domain, 1830. He grows up really interested in education, interested in learning. He leaves his domain to go and study in Edo because this is where you can learn about military affairs, advanced military affairs. From some sort of top strategic thinkers there, some top technical people in Edo. He almost gets permission to do that, but he leaves before permission comes through, which sounds like a small thing. But in this period, to leave your domain without having official permission come through is a really serious offense. But he's in Edo for a while anyway. This is right at the beginning of the 1850s. Um, then he has this lovely moment where he gets punished for leaving his domain without permission. But his punishment, good and bad, he loses his samurai status, so that's bad. But he then is sentenced to 10 years where he can basically do what he likes. 10 years of enforced leisure, 10-year sabbatical,
Oh,
which sounds
I
amazing.
like that.
Yeah, what a great
Sign me up.
deal, right? Absolutely, fantastic. So he can do whatever he likes, and that includes being able to go wherever he wants. So he then is in Edo when Commodore Mathew C. Perry turns up in the summer of 1853, and he goes to the coast of Edo Bay with lots and lots of other people who are still samurai who'd been rushed there to go and sort of defend Japan if these sort of weird foreigners
Mhm.
try anything. Um, and for him, it's this really pivotal moment. I mean, it is a pivotal moment for Japan. I won't labor it because I'm sure people know quite a bit about it. We can, excuse me, perhaps go back to it if you want to. But in brief, Matthew C. Perry turns up with these steam-powered warships. You can find these woodblock prints where these things are remembered as being almost animated by evil spirits. One of the woodblock prints has a face on the front of it, a kind of demonic
Oh,
face, and they're spewing this black smoke. And people haven't seen steamship technology. It looks, for some, it looks scary and it looks awful. For people like Yoshida Shoin, it just looks like something Japan needs to have yesterday, really, really urgently. And Perry, when he lands, he has a message from his president. Basically, Japan has to um, agree to help American sailors out if they get into trouble, give them fuel, give them food, rescue them if they get sunk, small things like that. But it's kind of a thin end of a wedge. What the US really want and what the British and the French and the Prussians really want, the Russians, sorry, really want is full on trade with Japan. Whereas Japan, as we've been saying, right, has this really strong policy of national seclusion. So Perry's asking for all this and asking for it in quite a rough way. I feel bad as a Brit complaining about gunboat diplomacy because we were doing a fair bit of that at this point in history, in places like China.
yeah.
But this is American style, gunboat diplomacy. Perry even gives them a piece of white cloth and he says, look, I'm going to come back for your answer next year. And if it's no, that we're going to basically go to war and you can use this to surrender with because, look out to sea. Look what I've come
Oh,
equipped with. And he says, not only have I got those ships, I've got some more in the Pacific and then I've got yet more in the United States. So he's it's kind of like Francis Xavier with the Buddhists. He thought we need to put on a good show. So give us these vestments and incense, etc. Commodore Matthew C. Perry had read about Japan in New York City Public Library, and he'd come to the same conclusion. You've got to put on a show. So he's got his warships out there. He brings 2 military bands onto the shore, has them playing Hail Columbia to try and scare the bejesus out of the Japanese, basically. Which he does, I think, quite successfully. And so to kind of fast forward with Yoshida Shoin and why he's so important, he only sees Perry from the coast at this point. He doesn't get to go out to the ships. But the next year, when Perry comes back, Yoshida
mhm.
Shoin rows out to Perry's ship in the dead of night to try and see what's going on. This beautifully exploratory, adventurous spirit, which is what he's so celebrated for. So he does that. Sadly, he doesn't get to meet Perry. He doesn't get further than some initial figures, including the American translator on board, who think he might be a spy. Not unreasonably, if a Japanese guy turns up in the dead of night in a boat approaching your ship, you're not immediately going to say, do you want to come and meet the captain? You're
Oh,
probably going to interrogate them, which is what happens. And poor Yoshida Shoin, he gets turned away from the ship, but he has seen it. So that's really important. He's had a really influential tour of it, which leaves quite an impression. But then the shogunate don't like the fact that he's done that, obviously. That's really subverting their authority. So they stick him in prison. And the rest of his life is a mixture of running a private educational establishment back at home in Choshu, Sonjaku Academy, and plotting to sort of rise up against the shogunate. And this is what he's remembered for. It's a lovely moment in Japanese history. I find it incredibly romantic because young men like this, if you really want to get something done politically, what you do is, this is a long time before the days of, form a Google group or a Reddit subgroup or something. You form a private academy where people can physically come and study with you, and you'll teach them that toxic, not toxic, let's say potent combination of politics and gunnery and swordsmanship and history lessons with political radicalism. That's what you do. And he gathers together these people in this academy. And the roster list for that academy, it reads like a who's who of what becomes the Meiji Restoration, Japan's founding fathers. Great figures like Ito Hirobumi, Yamagata Aritomo, studying with Yoshida Shoin, who's this, seems to be this incredibly forward-thinking, charismatic figure. And what's he saying Japan has to do? He's saying we have to put the emperor at the center of everything now. Political loyalty and personal loyalty focused on the emperor. Later, towards the end of his life, which we'll come to, if necessary, we have to rise up against the shogunate because they're not fit to lead anymore. And if you think about what is the shogun, barbarian crushing generalissimo, he works for the emperor in the end. So if he's not doing his job, he has to go, and the emperor has to kind of come back more actively to the center of politics. He thought people should be equal. He thought you could have something called a university in Japan, where in theory, children from the imperial family can come and study with commoner children. So this is extraordinarily radical,
Oh,
right, in this time. Yeah.
progressive.
Yeah, incredibly progressive, right? And he says the Japanese should now go abroad, they should learn abroad, they should trade abroad, all these sorts of things that Japan eventually does. But Yoshida Shoin there he is calling for it in the early 1850s. Well, kind of across the 1850s, he's really calling for this. And poor guy, having done all this, he gets pushed to the point where he feels as though he needs to rise up against the shogunate. What the shogunate has started to do, right, by this point, and we're talking really about the end of the 1850s, they've started to do what I would have done early on, is any young men who are interested in that potent brew of things that we've described, round them up. And they both round them up and then begin to execute them. And so Yoshida Shoin launches a plan to assassinate the senior person in the shogunate. That gets discovered, he gets imprisoned, and in the end, he is executed. So he becomes a kind of political martyr, but an incredibly powerful focal point, I think, for young Japanese men who've had it with the older generation and want to do something radical. That's why he's a great figure, I think.
That sounds like very appropriate for today's age.
Yes,
Before
yeah.
we go on to the next one, back on Matthew Perry, did
Yeah.
he write anything about that experience? I mean, I know he didn't actually get to meet Yoshida Showing, but did he leave a memoir or any impressions of his trip to Japan?
He did,
Trips.
yeah. Trips, yeah, plural. Yes, he did leave a memoir, which you can find online. Where did I get it? Perhaps archive.org. I'll maybe post something to notes, post a link for people
Yeah.
on
Okay.
Substack. But it's I mean, it's as is the way with some of these memoirs or reports. They're quite self-justifying and how it all went smoothly and how he did the right thing, etc. And how things like he thought the Japanese were physically rather puny and that the Americans could quite easily take the country if they wanted to. But what's really interesting is kind of the other way around, and we'll get to this in a moment. But the Japanese thought the same about Americans
Yeah.
and Europeans, that they could take them. So in a kind of sort of really basic playground type mentality, they're both thinking, they could
Oh,
take each other out if they had to.
right. Once again, it sounds like it has ramifications for the current age.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Oh, great. And by the way, I'm curious. So Yoshida Shoin went out in a rowboat. This is in Yokohama Bay, or where exactly did this happen?
Yeah, so this will be where the Americans came back the second time, just off the coast near Edo Bay. This was the spring
Oh,
of 1854. So he
oh,
rode
okay.
out to meet them from there. It was then a few years later that the Japanese developed Yokohama as a port. So
Okay.
that was from late
Neat.
1850s onwards. Yeah.
Great, great. Well, I'm thinking of The Last Samurai here, which was another 10 years forward. But okay, that is quite an interesting true story. So thank you
Mm,
very much
pleasure.
on that. Wow, time is flying by. We got to
Gosh,
move on to the
sorry. Yeah.
next one. Now, it sounds like since you spent time at Keio University, you know a lot about the founder of that university, our next person we're going to talk to, Fukuzawa Yukichi.
Yeah, Fukuzawa Yukichi, he's an interesting complement, I think, to Yoshida. He's pretty much the same generation, born a few years after Yoshida, I think 1835. Um, kind of a man in a similar spirit to Yoshida, in the sense that he thinks Japan urgently needs to learn from the West. Fukuzawa starts life as a translator from between Japanese and Dutch. So he trains down in Nagasaki. He's one of these people who does what's called rangaku, Dutch studies, where they learn Dutch language. Although rangaku, Dutch studies, extends to things like different techniques in painting, medicine, the sciences. So in all these areas, you find sort of intellectually intrepid Japanese are traveling to Nagasaki to try and learn with the Dutch. Fukuzawa Yukichi does that. And in the course of doing this, he develops I think, quite a radical sense of what Japan needs to do. And it's similar to Yoshida Shoin in the sense that there needs to be an opening up to the West. There needs to be a valuing, he thinks, of practical learning over kind of abstract learning. So some of my students at Edinburgh, when we get to deeply into our material as historians, as teachers, they'll want to know, well, what's the practical takeaway here? How can I use this in my life? Fukuzawa was very much into that. So he would say some Confucian scholars of his day, he once had this lovely phrase, rice consuming dictionaries. Means they are kind of pointless intellectuals who know a lot, but none of it is relevant to Japan. So they're just eating rice and storing loads of semi-relevant information in their heads. So quite a harsh critique, where he said, actually, one of the things that the West is very good at is practical knowledge, applied knowledge, technology, science, medicine, these sorts of things. And I love that insight because it's really a theme in Japan through the 19th century and on into the early 20th century. A lot of Japanese intellectuals like to make this distinction between Western learning and a Western view of the world, which is all about tearing nature apart, trying to understand it, putting it back together, using it, if you want to think about it negatively, exploiting it. Whereas in Japan, people are much more interested in values, in how people behave, how they conduct themselves, and being close to nature. So one of the future emperor's tutors once said, this is a brief jump forward to the 1870s, but he once said that the only Western values are fact gathering and technique, which I think is a wonderfully compressed way of saying all these critical things that the Japanese started to think about the West eventually. But in Fukuzawa's time, it was clear to him that there was just so much that Japan needed to pick up from the West that he started to really advocate for that. Where he differs from Yoshida, I think, is that he, maybe more a man after my own heart, he was a more sort of see who's currently in charge, cozy up to them a little bit, keep your head down. So he worked for the shogunate rather than against it. Uh, um, and he got to go on this absolutely fascinating trip in 1860. So this is days of ferment. This is post Mathew Perry, but before the Civil War, which eventually launches the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So at this point, the shogunate is still just about in charge, and it sends an embassy to the United States. First ever Japanese embassy to go to the US in 1860. Well worth reading about this. And Fukuzawa goes on that trip. And this is how he learns all these things that clearly Japan so badly needs, because places like San Francisco, Washington, D.C., that he sees are harboring industry, the technology, commerce, banking, you name it, Japan needs it as far as he's concerned. And there are these lovely little moments because he's a very smart guy and he's remembered as being a great intellectual, but he also found it really surprising in Washington that when he got there, that the people in charge in Washington were not the descendants of George Washington. As would be the case in Edo, the descendants of Tokugawa Ieyasu, right, are running the show. So he said, how weird that in America, the top politician has to effectively go to the people and beg for his job again every 4 years. I mean, you just couldn't imagine the shogun or the emperor saying, please may I continue, every 4 years. The complete madness. So there are all sorts of funny things he found surprising about the West. But his big takeaway was that Japan really had to, as quickly as possible, gain all this practical learning. So just like Yoshida, send people abroad, learn in all these specialisms, and get them back to Japan. And so Keio University, this famous university in Tokyo, was founded partly with that in mind, being a place where young Japanese could learn about all these ideas. So he's remembered for that. Couple more things very briefly before we move on. I should mention he's remembered as the founder of an important newspaper. If you wanted to get ideas out in Japan at this point, yes, you could have a private academy, but if you could also publish a newspaper, then of course you're in business in terms of getting your message out. So the Jiji Shimpo, great newspaper he founded, and yeah, all round hugely influential, intellectual, pushing the idea that Japan should open up its borders and learn what it could from the West.
Now, how did he communicate when he went on this trip to the United States? And I mean, was he still speaking Dutch at the time, or did he learn English?
So he had enough English to get by. So he was fine, fine in those terms. But then there was a lot of cultural miscommunication, I think, over the menu, for example. Memorably, there are a couple of memoirs of that trip, and people talk about being served a horrible soup dish that had a fish, a tasteless fish bobbing around in the top of it. Then there was a salmon dish where I think all they'd done was dip the salmon in some boiling water and take it out again, so there was no flavor. They were given rice. People thought they might want to eat rice because they were Japanese, but they'd cooked it in butter, which I think was also kind of weird and disgusting. So language was basically okay, but these sorts of cultural miscommunications, again, I find fascinating. One thing Fukuzawa said happened on that trip was the Japanese didn't yet have a sense of how credit systems worked. And so they physically brought a huge stash of silver bullion on their ship or their ships going to the US so they could pay their way. There was no sense that
Hmm,
they could have a credit arrangement that would stop them having to bring cash. So these lovely little moments of miscommunication really stand out for me.
interesting. Hey,
Mm,
I have a couple more questions, but speaking of questions, since we have quite a few listeners on
mm.
right now, please, if you got any specific questions, put them in the chat, and we could cover any subject that you'd like. Back on Fukuzawa Yukichi,
Mm.
I understand though that especially he has been criticized though for what his viewpoints on Japan's role in the rest of Asia. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah, he I always think when we talk about it at university, I always show my students a map of Japan, a map of the world, sorry, with Japan in the center, which is of course how people in Japan grow up thinking about the world. And if you imagine for a moment, if you visualize that map and boil down Japan's decision making in the modern era, second half of the 19th century, let's say, to do we look westwards? Westwards in
Mm.
terms of the map gets a bit complicated towards Asia. Or do we look across the Pacific towards the United States and Europe in terms of who do we want our friends to be? What sort of cultural relationships do we want? What sort of country do we want to be? And Fukuzawa put forward the point of view that we need to, in his words, escape Asia. So his view, rather harshly, was that um, Asia, Asian culture at this point didn't have terribly much to offer Japan, and Asia itself, in terms of China and Korea, particularly China, was suffering so badly under European colonialism that um, it was just a sort of a dangerous place to get involved with, and that the Japanese shouldn't have too much. To do with it. So I think he has been criticized for that view. And there were people in the next generation, actually, who took a very different view about Asia. But in Fukuzawa's time, or certainly his view, was that Japan had to play such a rapid game of catch up. It couldn't afford to mess about, and it had to really focus its efforts. And that meant looking towards the US and Western Europe, certainly in the years to come, as far as he was concerned.
So, okay, thank you for clarifying that. I remember reading about how Japan at the time, or well, I suppose maybe you could go a little bit into detail about exactly what happened to for the Meiji Restoration to occur, and then Fukuzawa's relationship to that, and then after that, how did they determine, for example, railroads they were going to study from the UK, right, or from Britain at the time.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe war or military activity from the United States or France. What can you explain a little bit more about that? It's always kind of
Yeah.
fuzzy to me.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have this period of ferment after Perry arrives, and people like Yoshida Shoin are involved in that. Builds up until you have a civil war in Japan, 1868 to 1869, which basically pitches forces, military forces, rebelling against the shogunate to take the young emperor as their figurehead against the forces of the shogunate and their allies. And if you think about a map of the Japanese archipelago, starting in Kyoto, they call themselves imperial forces, loyal to the emperor. They chase um, the shogun's forces, or they push them all the way up Honshu, up across to Ezo, what's now Hokkaido. And then the shogunate set up this short-lived republic, the short-lived and the only republic in Japan's history, which doesn't last very long because they come and get crushed by the imperial forces. Once that's over in 1869, it's a really busy few years. And that question about Western models, the government is based in Edo. They rename it Tokyo, right? Eastern capital. And then senior leaders of the government go on a worldwide tour between 1871 to 73. Basically, they go all the way around the world, including lots of places in the US, Western Europe, Russia, Southeast Asia, etc., looking to see in each country who has what looks like the best or most advanced example of any particular system. And they think, well, that's the one that we will have in that case. And sometimes these decisions, I think, are quite finely balanced. So initially, for the military, the French are the model. But then they lose to a war against Prussia. So the Japanese think, okay, clearly the Prussians are the ones we want to learn from. So it's a very finely tuned process. And then there's a certain amount of innovation as well. So the example we sometimes talk about is the post office. Japanese post office is based on the British post office. But in Britain, women were allowed to work in the post office, and that was a no-no in Japan. So in some little details, these things get changed very slightly. But it's a very finely tuned process. Even now, in just one more brief example, in Japanese medicine, still
Yeah.
there are like karite. Some German words are still used in Japanese medicine because German medicine was the best in the world at the time, and so that's what they learned from. So it's a really it's the intensity of just a few years in which Japan got so much done. When I think about British politics, maybe I'm being unfair, but we'll talk and talk and talk for years about the NHS needing reform or whatever else it might be. The Japanese, in a few years, they just went and did it. It's just extraordinary.
And what was Fukuzawa Yukichi's role during that specific time?
So he was really heavily involved in advising the people who became the Meiji leaders. He was writing about his theory on civilization, where he wanted to he wanted to come up with a kind of a grand theory of world history and of civilization that would basically say that the trend of global events at the moment is towards the West. This is where civilization is to be found at the moment, and the Japanese need to learn from that. He wasn't by any means rejecting the entirety of Japanese culture, although some critics would say that he went too far. Um, but he wanted to come up with an ideal of civilization in terms of how people behave, how our society is run, how our country's politics is organized. Um, that definition, and then sort of persuade the Japanese of those ideas. And he also wrote these little introductions to the West, which were instant bestsellers because he knew what he was talking about. He'd been there, he'd been to the US, he'd been to Europe. And so funneling information about the West to Japan in Japanese and in a way that would persuade ordinary people that Westerners were worth engaging with because in the Bakumatsu period, we call it the end of the shogunate, Westerners didn't always cover themselves in glory. Foreign traders and others in Japan sometimes behaved quite badly. There's a history in Japan of regarding outsiders as somewhat barbaric. So Fukuzawa Yukichi is quite important, I think, for pushing back against that. and saying, no, actually, we can't afford that kind of an attitude. That's actually the sort of attitude that the Chinese have employed. And look what happened to them. Their country steadily being carved up by Westerners. So I think he was really essential in playing that public education role.
Interesting. Now, we're right this year, or perhaps next year, in a couple of years, there might be as many as 40 million Western or foreigners, not just Westerners, but all foreigners visiting Japan. New record every month,
Yeah.
practically.
Mm.
Back in the day, so to speak, when Fukuzawa Yukichi was traveling in Europe and in America, I mean, it must have been extraordinarily unusual to have the ability to go abroad from Japan. I mean, like, how many people a year would have gone even anywhere?
From Japan to Europe, that direction or the other
Yeah.
way, or from
Well,
Japan.
both. Yeah.
Well, but yeah, it's interesting on both sides. From Japan to Europe, the numbers start to pick up in the 1870s and 1880s. So if you are a young, relatively educated Japanese man, and sadly it is mostly men in this period, you can get government money to go abroad and to study for a while, to pick up whatever your specialism might be, and then come back and set that up in a university or a factory or whatever it might be. Because in the really early years of the Meiji period, right? So we're thinking about the 1870s, 1880s, lots of foreign experts were employed in Japan, architects, tech people, medicine, business, banking. But as quickly as possible, the Japanese wanted to have Japanese people be the experts in these subjects. Hence, they would give you this money to go away, become an expert, come back and share your knowledge. So people
Oh,
like the great novelist Natsume Soseki,
mm,
he travels abroad, goes to Britain, famously doesn't like London very much, prefers Scotland, um, and is studying Shakespeare actually in his case. Um, and he sends back his thoughts. He writes beautifully his diaries about London. So that's going on a fair bit. Numbers, I'm not entirely sure. The numbers certainly
okay.
go up and up across the sort of 1880s onwards. Um, and in the other direction, someone I would really recommend people read if they want to get a flavor of how Westerners were thinking about Japan. I know that's a bit of a generalization. Nevertheless, in this period, is someone called Isabella Bird. So she is,
Oh, I've heard of her.
you've
Yes.
heard of her, right? So she
Mm,
is sort of a famous traveler, actually, who goes all over the place,
and
um,
Tohoku, right?
travels say again, sorry?
Oh, mainly in Tohoku area, is that right?
She goes up through there. She even goes up
Yeah.
to what's now Hokkaido to meet the Ainu.
Ah,
She goes
yeah,
through
yeah.
Edo as well,
Yeah.
um, and she's great because she doesn't just describe what she sees, but she's constantly interpreting, stroke judging. And as you
Mm.
imagine, there's often a
Uh-oh.
sort of yeah. Your facial expression is entirely accurate for her material, I think. She sort of has that sense of superiority, I think, of
Ah,
foreigners, many in Japan. But she is interested in Japanese culture. Um, I think she's great to read. And then maybe if I was going to give you one more figure, not so much a visitor, but I suppose he actually sets up his life and family in Japan, Lafcadio Hearn.
oh, yes, yes.
Um, yeah, another relatively famous figure. His writing in this period is well worth reading. I know some people think history and primary source is a bit of a dusty affair, but the language in this period for Westerners writing about Japan and Japanese writing about the West, if you can find, for example, Fukuzawa in translation or read him in Japanese,
Mhm.
the language
Mm.
that they used to write about one another is fascinating. And it's often a comment on their own home societies. This is another really big theme, I think, for travelers to Japan. And I was guilty of it, absolutely. My wife used to work, she used to teach English in a language school. And she would say one of the things foreigners constantly did in a language class was complain about Japan. This doesn't work, or I don't like this, or attitudes towards women, or whatever it might be. Um, but on the one hand, it irritated her, and on the other hand, it was an interesting way of getting an insight into what these people thought was good or bad about their home societies. You could tell what their values were, what their cultural baggage was. And so people like Isabella Bird, Lafcadio Hearn, probably more so Bird, because Hearn is quite a Japanophile, right? Whereas Bird is more a traveler. You can really read their own cultural baggage into their writing. And she's a fantastically talented writer. She's the equivalent of an influencer in her own day because she's got a really acute sense of the publishing market. And so she's really gearing her prose towards these people, which means it's that much more entertaining in the process, I think.
Oh, well, thank you for reminding me about her. Yeah, I think all of us are going to learn a lot more about Lafcadio Han pretty soon because I believe that's part of the subject, or his wife is actually the subject of the next NHK daily drama, kind of starting soon. But
Wonderful.
yeah,
I look
these
forward to
are
that.
hard. Yes. Oh my goodness. Wow, I can't believe it. It's an hour already. But let's check and see if we've got any questions. I mean, you've certainly been very thorough and great stories. It looks like we don't have any specific questions, but anyone that we have a few minutes left with Chris. If you've got any burning question, now's the
Sure.
time. And if you don't, you can always get in touch with him by Substack, right? Can you tell us? I'll put it in the notes for this, but can you
Oh,
tell
thank
us
you.
about your own Substack and website, please?
Yeah, thank you. So it's called History with Chris Harding, nice and simple. Almost all of it is on Japan and the sorts of East-West relationships that we've been talking about today. So kind of a mixture of contemporary things and historical things. And I publish something every week on a Tuesday.
Oh, very specific. Terrific. Hey, we have a
Yeah.
question. We hear a lot about the influence of Perry.
Mm.
Who were the major British shakers and movers, or movers and shakers at the time?
God, that's an interesting question. I wish we had some, to be honest. I'm not sure how. I suppose one of the areas of influence for the British in Japan at this point, we're talking about those models, different countries being models for different things, would have been the Navy, actually. I'm always really
Mm,
interested because the Royal Navy at this time um, was the biggest and best in the world. It was shortly not to be the case, and shortly, of course, famous to compete with Japan in the Second World War. But at this point, um, the influence of the British Royal Navy in Japan amongst naval people um, was so extreme that in Japanese naval academies, they would hang a portrait of Admiral Lord Nelson on the wall as being this sort of inspiring figure for people to look up to, a great strategist on the sea. And when, in lovely little story to finish on, when in 1905 the Japanese were victorious in their war against Russia, this great victory from the Japanese point of view against a European power, the British gave the Japanese a lock of Admiral Lord Nelson's hair as a way of saying, congratulations, you've just joined the big boy club. Well done. So I suppose that would be one little area of influence for the British in Japan that comes to mind. It's a lovely question. Thank you.
sure. Hey, we have another question. Um, Chris, are you friends or rivals with Matt Alt?
Matt Alt. I don't know him personally, but I do follow his Substack. I think it's Pure Invention, isn't it? So,
Yeah, I
yeah,
like it too.
neither of, yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? I'd say neither a friend or a rival. I would say I would defer to him on Japanese pop culture.
There we
Absolutely.
go.
He's got a depth of insight, which I find really impressive. So I would say friend, but I've never met him. So sort of.
Okay, that's fair. Hey, before you go, you have any specific recommendations for maybe out of the way spots in Japan that might have particular historical interest?
Yes, there is one. I feel a bit bad recommending it because I've never been there, but it sounds amazing. I would love to go, which is the original room used by Yoshida Shoin for his
Mm,
private academy. They have kept it. I believe it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site in what is now Yamaguchi Prefecture. I think it's called Hagi, the
yeah,
particular
I,
place. Yes, yeah.
mm,
So I've never been, but I've seen photos and I've read a little bit about it. And next time I'm in Japan, I would love to go. I think to soak up the atmosphere and to imagine yourself seated at the feet of Yoshida Shoin, or at the knees, I suppose, if everyone's kneeling down on the tatami, of Yoshida Shoin and imbibing these radical ideas. I think that'd be beautiful.
that sounds good. That's on my list too. Okay, before we let you go, you need to tell us a little bit about your next project, which is a new book called Barbarians, correct?
Oh, yes, yes, very quickly, thank you. Working on it now, it's going to be a book about the first century of contact between Europe and Japan. So, in that age of
Oh,
Francis Xavier and Portuguese traders, and ending in the era that Disney's Shogun is covering, right? So beautifully. They're doing another 2 seasons. I don't know what they're going to cover because they blew quite a lot of their source material from the novel in season one. Um, and briefly, it's called Barbarians because what fascinates me is the idea that in European eyes, the Japanese were barbarians because they appeared to take life so easily and these sorts of things.
ah,
And of course, in Japanese eyes, for reasons that we talked about at the beginning, the Europeans were barbarians. So, this fascinating moment of cultural contact, I'm going to really dig into.
all right, well, can't wait. And thank you, everyone, for participating from two barbarians or at least real gaijin at the moment. We will look forward to the future projects of Chris and also all of your work on BBC and other projects. In the meantime, we'll stay in touch through Substack. Chris, thank you so much. You want to say goodbye to everybody?
It will, yeah. Thank you very much for having me on. I really enjoyed chatting. I hope people have enjoyed it too.
All right. Well, you're very welcome. I had a great time. Once again, as promised, I will put together a recording of this. Give me 24 hours, please, and we'll
Brilliant.
put some highlights in there and links to some of Chris's sites and other things that he talked about. So thank you again, everyone. Until next time, we'll sign off now. Have a good day.
Thank you.
お疲れ様でした。
Thanks for watching and or listening to another story from the Read My Lips series of podcasts on Real Gaijin. Tell us what you think and be sure to tune in again next time.
Yoo-hoo!